The continuity Decalogue. First of all, there are barely any instances of total evacuation of a territory which were not caused by a major military defeat. In fact, the Goths, on account of whom Aurelian had ordered the withdrawal, had not proven to be that destructive, no matter where they had passed through or settled, and we actually have proof of that. In Dacia. It was the locals who were guiding them through the mountain passes to attack the Roman army. In one document, a bishop claims that the local population often preferred the rule of barbarian chieftains who were content to get a share of the food they produced, while the Roman administration and taxes would crush them mercilessly. Second, our great archaeologist Vasile Pervan discovered two documents from the 4th century AD in which a king of the Goths from our parts north of the Danube called himself a Yud, which is not a title that the emperor in Constantinople could have conferred on him, unlike those of patrician, despot or Caesar, but merely what Dacu Romanians call the rulers of a group of villages or a valley, their judges and administrators, a term that will survive until much later. It follows that this barbarian king from north of the Danube ruled over a Latin-speaking population and wanted to call himself by the name that his subjects would normally give to their rulers. Third, the statement that all traces of Latin inscriptions in Dacia disappeared after the withdrawal of the legions and administration is incorrect. A few were found from the 4th and 5th centuries, very few indeed, which can be explained by near total desertion of the cities and a complete regression towards rurality. The few written documents dating from the following centuries that were discovered only mention the various barbarian ruling elements who played a role in wars and politics, and not the local peasantry, whom the barbarians would still have needed to provide them with food. This is a constant in universal history. No one talks about the population of fallen empires, only about the new masters. The fourth point, the silence of documents, a silentio argument, is not a valid argument. Let us set aside our exclusive, almost superstitious trust in the written document. History is not only reconstructed with written documents. The Latin speakers of Switzerland, Retia, are not mentioned in any such documents, yet they speak the Romansh language to this day. And closer to home, there are no written documents about the Albanians for over 1,000 years, and even longer silence than in our case, yet the Greek or Slavic neighbors could have not argued that the Albanians simply fell from the skies where we find them today and where they have been mentioned in antiquity. Fifth, the late mentions of Romanians in official Hungarian documents has a simple explanation. It was only around the 12th or 13th century that Hungarian feudal structures and royal authority became sufficiently present to govern. That was when Romanian villages, rulers and nobles, either pressured by Hungarian tax collectors or called before a court, began to need a royal chancellery or some local authority to have their ancestral rights recognized. Observe, if you will, how a series of Romanian words that can have distant legal connotation are of Hungarian origin. To promise, a făgădui, to delay, a tăgădui, to settle a score, a serafui, to suspect, a bănui, to ponder, a chibzui, to allow, a îngădui, to redeem, a mântui, etc. We even venerate Christ as the Redeemer, or Mântuitorul, using a word coming from a Hungarian root. If the Romanians had only arrived in Transylvania during the 12th and 13th century, it is hard to imagine that they would have assimilated such essential notions without having already lived around the Hungarians for several centuries and then spread them across all the territories they inhabited. Sixth, it is quite typical that in the first documents, Romanians, or blacks, are located in the woods, meaning vast forested areas, because there, in clearings surrounded by dense forest, it was easier to defend against enemy cavalry. For example, shortly after 1200s, the region of Făgăraș is called Silva Blacorum and Bisenorum, the woods of the Vlachs and Pechenegs, in a royal charter granting that land to German or Saxon colonists. The Romanians were recently colonized nomadic shepherds from the south, as Rossler's theory claims. Would they have taken flocks of sheep into the woods? The archaeologist Radu Popa, who died before his time, has located other regions in Transylvania that were first called Silvae in Latin, before they were turned into administrative counties ruled by Hungarian counts. Furthermore, the association between heavily wooded areas and Vlachs is also found south of Carpathians in modern Wallachia. Do you know what the name of Vlachka county means? In the old Slavic language, it meant land of the Vlachs. How about Codrul Vlăsiei? Ancient woodland in Wallachia, of which a very small portion survives to this day, northwest of Bucharest, but which covered an enormous area in Middle Ages. Vlasie is the Slavic plural of Vlach, meaning Wallachian or Romanian, so it literally means the wood of the Romanians, or Vlachs. Even the name of modern-day Telorman County is proof of a dense woodland which once existed there, inhabited by the natives, since Deli Orman means mad forest in Turkic languages, spoken by both Pechenegs and Cumans. So it was not just the Transylvanian forest, but also those in the Wallachian lowlands that were inhabited by ancestors of the Romanians in the early Middle Ages, even before they mixed with the Slavs, otherwise they would have not called them Vlasie. Let us be clear, when I say woods, silve in Latin, you must imagine immense wooded areas the size of a county or two, in the depths of which could be found naturally empty spaces or large areas cleared by men, deforested and grubbed up, where entire communities lived off the cultivation of millet, onions and cabbage, the herding of cattle and the farming of pigs and poultry. In these clearings, people were relatively more protected from marauding nomadic cavalry. Yet we have sources which reveal how the nomads still managed to detect these inhabited oases. From afar, they simply observed the flight of circling birds. If the birds kept hovering over a particular spot, the nomads would know they were looking for leftovers or rotting corpses, and headed straight for that place. 7th. As to the alleged Bulgarian or Macedonian words found in the Romanian language, our ancestors did not live in the Balkans to adopt them. They were common words among the Slavic tribes across the southeast of Europe, many of which must have settled north of the Danube all over the territory of our country. Documents mention Slavic enclaves up until the 13th century. In fact, the former Aurelian Dacia, which the ancestors of the Romanians allegedly abandoned, was overrun by West Slavic tribes who produced the Serbian and Croatian languages, whereas the Slavic words in Romanian belong to the East Slavic group, which includes the closely related Bulgarian and Macedonian languages. In the territories north of Danube, the Slavs mainly settled in fertile valleys, where they left traces in the names of rivers, found relatively close together: Dâmbovița, Ialomița, Prahova, Neșlov, Milkov, Bistrița, etc. Only gradually did they mix with their local Vlach neighbors and let themselves be Romanianized. Relying on the rules of language evolution, linguists believe that the fusion between the late Latin of the Vlachs and the Slavic language of the newcomers only began around the 9th century, when the transformation of late Latin into Proto-Romanian was almost complete. That is why Slavic influence on the grammatical structure and the form of words in our language is almost non-existent, yet massive on the vocabulary. Compared with French, for example, the mix between Gallo-Romans and Germanic people, Franks, Romanians, etc., happened much earlier on, and thus the impact on the new Romance language, especially in relation to morphology and phonetics, was far greater. 8th. As to the so-called borrowed words from Albanian, modern linguists tend to explain the similarities between the two languages, amounting to just a few dozen words, through a common Indo-European origin. Why would a Romanized and thus more culturally advanced population have to borrow words from its Albanian unromanized, less civilized neighbors in the first place? Similarly, we do not need to imagine our ancestors living south of the Danube to explain why Daco-Romanian, Aromanian and Megleno-Romanian are cognates, since the same mix of people speaking the same late Eastern Latin can yield the same results, even 1,000 kilometers apart. In fact, in Daco-Romanian we have a few examples of words for plants and materials which are not found south of the Danube. How could they have been preserved in the language for thousands of years if our ancestors had all migrated south? I'll provide just one example, yet quite a relevant one. How could the word păcură, from picula in Latin, meaning crude oil, have been preserved south of the Danube if crude oil only naturally surged from the ground at the foothills of the Carpathians? 9th. Hungarian historians are not trying to deny the historical value of a crucial document, the chronicle written in Latin by an unknown clerk of King Bela of Hungary, known to history only as Anonymous. This document, probably based on an earlier chronicle, is of an absolute capital importance to our history, because it tells of how the Hungarians, who first invaded Transylvania from the west, encountered 3 voivodeships inhabited by Romanians and Slavs. This piece of information, namely that the Magyars come across the Vlachs after crossing the northern Carpathians, is also found in an even older Kievan Rus chronicle, known as Nestor's Chronicle, a completely independent source. There is just one strong argument in favor of these critics. It is the mention Anonymous makes of the Cumans among the peoples found in Transylvania at the time, yet we know that they did not arrive north of the Danube until about 115 years after the Pechenegs and Hungarians. Nevertheless, such time warps are often to be found in chronicles, and to add to the confusion, the Pechenegs and the Cumans spoke roughly the same language. The names of the three voivodes, Glad, Menomorut, and Gelu, are a source of debate in themselves. Only the latter is preserved as a Vlah, so Hungarian historians try very hard to find a Hungarian origin for his name, while at the same time drawing attention to the poverty of his people and the poor quality of the weapons used by his warriors. We are used to writing his name as Gelu and pronounce it the way we do in modern Romanian, Gelu. But in the classical Latin of the chronicle, the G must have been hard, as in the English word geese, and the diphthong U, as in the English word show, would have been preserved, which gives us Gelu, probably a deformation of the Romanian name Gelo. And it is precisely in the region of Cluj, where the chronicle located the voivodeships of this Gelo, that we have a mountain, a river, and a settlement called either Gilo or Gilo throughout the ages. And I believe this have kept the name of the first Romanian voivode. The proof that this is an authentic Romanian name, maybe even an ancient one, comes from an ancient Greek text that mentions a settlement in Thrace called Gelupara, which means Gelu's village, and it's spelled in exactly the same way. Glad must be a Slavic name distorted by the chronicle, who also added that this voivode came from Vidin, and so was probably Bulgarian. Finally, Menomorut is obviously a Hungarian variant for the name of a Turkic chieftain, perhaps a Bulgarian or rather Proto-Bulgarian, ruling over a Vlach and Slavic population. 10th. In my view, however, the decisive argument in favor of continuity is the preservation of the ancient names of the Carpathian Mountains and of all the major rivers north of the Danube: Nistru, Prut, Siret, Buzău, Argeș, Olt, Timiș, Mureș, Criș, Someș, Tisa, etc., all of which had been attested even before the Roman conquest, and, most importantly, that of the Danube itself, in Romanian, Dunărea, which in Romanian has maintained a different form from the Latin Danubius, in fact one that is closer to river names found in the Baltic languages. Who else could have passed these ancient names on to migratory peoples like the Hungarians, other than a people who have stayed put despite endless waves of new arrivals? That is why I'm absolutely convinced that a great number of Roman-speaking enclaves survive interruptedly through the Dark and Middle Ages in the lands north of the Danube, with continuous links to populations living to the south, for the great river has never been a barrier to communication and movement.